Hello and welcome to my commentary on your Google Hangout 2 for the group comprising of Laura, Emily, Ubaldo, and Jesse. I wanted to thank you for a comprehensive and well-conducted and well-facilitated discussion. I did like how you organized your questions in order and covered the topics jointly, contributing iteratively to the discussion. So I just wanted to cover some of the areas that you discussed. Jesse started by question number 1, which is sort of framing this week's discussion about the interdependencies between the policymaker and the intelligence analyst, and sort of going back to how that relationship, how it's challenged, and how it's inherently challenged by the design, and what are some constraints on what the intelligence analysts do and what the policymaker do with the intelligence product. And I wanted to start by, Jesse, of course, discussed the fact that the agenda that is political tends to drive, or partisan issues might drive the intelligence collection. And I think that it's important to keep in mind that what Loventhal says is ultimately the policymaker that is a consumer of the intelligence product, something that Jesse brought out, this whole issue of intelligence process being a service to the policymaker. So I want you to go back and think about requirements as a first step in the intelligence cycle. Those requirements are certainly being prioritized by the policymaker. So from the very beginning of the cycle, we are aware of the fact that the national security or homeland security strategy is going to dictate to the policymaker what they are looking for. So it's not necessarily the intelligence analyst that has a whole lot to say in what they are looking at. They are basically told what's needed. And perhaps the flaw here is in the fact that we're thinking about the intelligence cycle as starting with the requirements, and perhaps we should think in a little bit more depth about the feedback of the intelligence community, or even the different organizations that are reflecting on how usable or actionable the intelligence that's produced might be to them. And this is specifically important in a homeland security landscape, where it's that local level that should be having a say into what's actionable or workable or needed for them. But historically, that feedback loop is often forgotten, and we tend to start with requirements that will change, between the elected officials who have shorter lifespan, so to speak, that the intelligence community, aka intelligence analyst here. So if we start with the requirements, we know that by the virtue of requirement, we already have a focus on what to look for by the intelligence analysts. And it doesn't necessarily always fit into their agenda, their interest, or their expertise of a particular issue. And it's sort of that wall that is constraining them. And certainly, we're talking about the intelligence failures in weapons of mass destruction, but the intelligence failures were not necessarily the failures of intelligence analysts. They were the failures of how the questions were asked of the intelligence community, of what the policymakers wanted to know, and particularly in the issue of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That was very apparent that it was the requirement that was sort of structured in a way that handicapped the intelligence community. So a consumer or a partner, Jesse, suggested that, when we're talking about consumers, it's, a very economic approach or sort of servant approach. And that's, certainly the foundation of the intelligence process as conceived by Sherman Kent, in this ideal world where the intelligence analyst comes up with the facts that were requested, and then it is the warnee or the policymaker that has a responsibility or moral duty to act. And obviously, they have their own set of strategic responsibilities, and they will pick and choose, what is more actionable for them and what they're not going to heed, or, what takes the back burner. And I think Laura also mentioned that, it's not necessarily that intelligence analysts should have that influence of influencing policymaker decisions, because sometimes they are having a tunnel vision because they are very close to what they want to focus on, and they might be doing it for many years. They are an expert in that area, but they are not seeing a bigger picture, in this larger political realm. And at the same time, I think if you want to reconcile, the whole process, you have to look at relationships and trust, and how the policymaker will conceive of their relationship with that intelligence community, with intelligence analysis. If there is a strong trust relationship, they might be influenced more, or they might be more prone to act on certain elements of intelligence versus others. And certainly if policymakers who are by virtue, for most part, not intelligence community members, or do not have the background in that, it will depend on their own personalities, how much they want to rely or fall back on the intelligence analyst versus, how much they want to pick and choose. And Emily added that, certainly we often talk about intelligence failures, and the intelligence analysts are blamed for lack of intelligence or inadequate intelligence. But the fact is that, the information before 9/11 was there, and a lot of those different pieces of intelligence products were not being acted upon, or what good is intelligence if it's not actionable. But there's certainly, within the realm of politics, there is the national security and homeland security policies of a decision maker and a policymaker will influence to what degree some of the intelligence product gets integrated and what intelligent product doesn't. And Ubaldo, joined the discussion about Benghazi, and I think that you talked about the fact, and there was a little bit of exchange with Laura and Ubaldo on the fact that certainly the assessments, security assessments, were there and were provided by the intelligence analysis, but how they were used, it's a different story, and how they were operationalized, and ultimately the ambassador Stevens and other members of the diplomatic corps lost their lives, and certainly, that underscores that, you do have those assessments. It's just at the particular time in a threat landscape or in foreign relations or international relations, the policymaker may choose to forgo particular pieces of intelligence because of the current policy that they are pursuing. And Ubaldo, I think, switched here. The discussion sort of went, which I thought it was very interesting. It was off topic, but you start talking about leadership and in the military. And particularly about, you know, the executive level and the ground troops, and how the executive level is often detached with what's happening at the ground level, and yet the ground level will have a certain tactical information or situational awareness, or, you know, the operational picture, whereas the executives are not always, because they're not close to the sources or bits and pieces of information that are being analyzed. There is a disconnect, and I think that that's not, you know, necessarily the issue of intelligence analysis process or policymaker and intelligence analyst, but it's a question of leadership in hierarchical organizations. And I think it's very interesting, because I would argue that certainly in policing, for example, probably the most difficult job is for the first line supervisors, you know, from the leadership standpoint, because once you get to the first line supervision, you sort of in between those two worlds where, you know, you are no longer part of a troop. So you do have a little bit more responsibility to connect to that executive level. You are yet not part of command. So the responsibility on those first line supervisors is really huge. They're sort of part of a troop still, and they're in some ways trying to influence the executive part. And I think it's in the middle level management, how much of authority gets in a particular organization gets delegated to the middle level management might be the success of the organization versus failure of the organization. And perhaps that goes to what Ubaldo was saying, that you know, there is a disconnect between the top brass decision makers and people that are you know, subject matter experts on that tactical intelligence. And perhaps, you know, that's and that's an issue certainly of leadership, and also the issue of organizational culture, and certainly the issue of you know, that buffer on mid-level management. That's a linking pin, and it will be very much about personalities and competencies and training, and that is certainly a finding. And I don't know, you didn't discuss the issue of trilogy as the IT failure in the FBI trying to reach better technologies. I don't think you had any discussion in your group on that topic, but certainly in the trilogy case, it was very apparent that that middle level element was missing for implementation of the program. Program managers, program coordinators, people that oversaw piloting of the system, that it wasn't short-lived, people that would encourage bringing those voices of agents, for example, that would work with this virtual case file all the way to the substantive levels of decision makers at the top of the organization. And FBI had a very big vulnerability there, and because again, there is not a very strong middle level sort of system there. You know, if you look at FBI, it's pretty much, you know, the agents on the ground or substantive desks in field offices and, you know, on Pennsylvania Avenue. And culturally, the organization has not created a business model that's going to be more middle level driven. And perhaps that's something that you were speaking to, which is, you know, very interesting from the standpoint of organizational theory. Jesse, again, going back to your point on consumers and partners, you know, Emily mentioned the lack of interagency collaborations and lack of standards in analysis and competitive competitiveness between different parts of the intelligence community, where they think that their particular int is more important or more reliable. And you certainly had that discussion a week later after our hangout on competitive intelligence versus fused intelligence, or analytical standardization of trainings and protocols and so on and so forth. So I thought that discussion was really interesting. And Emily, talking about the job of the analyst was not to speculate or not to hypothesize or not to predict, that their job was to supply the facts that come from, that neutral, unbiased, ideally, right, analysis, because we did talk about the enemies of intelligence analysis. So somebody mentioned, I'm not sure who that was, but that we often see that the policymaker is his or her own analyst, and it's certainly also a threat to making those priority decisions, because it will depend on how big awareness of security issues they have, how well they rely on other components. I think Ubaldo was talking about advisors and generals and people that advise the policymakers. So certainly, some intelligence product might hinder the policymaker agenda. So they will again be choosing their political priorities, their policy agenda priorities in selecting what they're acting on. Laura, yes, talked about the fact that the intelligence analysts are supposed to provide the facts, but over the years, when they are working in a certain area, they do also develop that tunnel vision, and they would develop bias, which we would like ideally to think that you operate in a world of facts, but a lot of analysis is also interpretation. And if somebody is doing something for a very long time, they tend to develop certain mental models as well, and they might lack the external influence or perspectives on how it links to the overall picture. And I think that's this, difference between intelligence analysts being looked at more at the tactical level, where the policymaker is more of a strategic decision maker. Of course, you talked about the ambiguity of intelligence, that policymakers would like to have 100% certainty and push for, with limited amount of resources and time, they want very, very specific answers that are always to some degree subject to interpretation. So again, they realize that as well. Eventually, they bear the accountability, responsibility for their decisions of acting upon intelligence, and so that's obviously a constraint as well. Jesse was you start talking about so. As far as relationship between the policymaker and the intelligence analyst, certainly it's a intelligence analyst is a service provider in a way, and then depending on how good the policymaker, how well they listen, what degree of ability to project or to play out different options, it's still very much in their realm to take the actions. They are not to be influenced by intelligence analysts. And so the discussion went into the declassification and whether the policymaker executive should have the ultimate say in the secrecy. And Loventhal mentioned, obviously, that there is this constant friction between the policymakers wanting the process to be very well clear to everybody so people can interpret how they make decisions, where the intelligence community has sources and methods to protect, so they will safeguard that to ensure the integrity of the intelligence process. And I think that Laura, put the discussion on a really interesting track, talking about the inherent dangers of classification and protection of sources and methods being, a sort of coverall for everything, to actually obfuscating a lot of processes that do happen, and perhaps covering a lot of flaws, and classification process being redundant in a lot of cases. Stuff that does get classified does not need to get classified. And our classification process has been the intelligence community Achilles heel. And that's certainly, the drive towards declassification, I think, is very apparent in recent years. And perhaps it's because the intelligence reform sort of made the intelligence product sort of everybody's commodity, because those processes were sort of taken out strictly from the DoD and CIA, and entered the realm of Homeland Security, which is a little bit more OSINT driven. And here you've got this push for declassification. Also, I think bigger public hunger for more transparency, and I'm sure that you had some discussion on how, and I don't know if it was your group or another group, that most people do not really understand the stuff that's going to get declassified. They don't need it. They don't need to be educated on how those processes work. And doing that jeopardizes, again, the sources and methods. But I think that this is the argument that's been proposed by those who are very, very leery about declassifying. And I think you made really, really good points about how those decisions about declassifications are made depends on the political climate and international relations and foreign affairs as well. So, we might have thought that after Cold War, we will be able to declassify a lot of proposed processes. But now, with the current landscape of relationships with Russia, there is a sort of a step back to reevaluate, and that's certainly the intelligence sort of nested within the larger body of policymaking and politics, and how those decisions are made. But I think you all agreed that, yes, the executive does have the authority to declassify. Some of the processes are classified perhaps to obfuscate, and to make the process inaccessible. Safeguarding sources and methods is often used as an excuse to perhaps hide some more ominous processes that might be going on, or certain flaws in the intelligence community. And so, how much does the regular public have, how much do they have in that decision-making process? And, obviously this is driven by the current threat and hazard landscape. And it's interesting, since, I posted that question for you, declassification initiative sort of got backed off because, again, as Ubaldo said, there were some advisors in the intelligence community that strongly advised against it. So I, having had, and Laura, you have an experience in that, and I can tell you that I agree that classification is we overclassify, and certainly that that's very costly. That produces impediments for intelligence analysts in a lot of ways. That's provides impediments to information sharing because those classification processes might differ among different agencies. So revisiting the classification system, I think certainly merits an ongoing discussion and research. But of course, research is very difficult on intelligence when, everything is safeguarded by sources and methods. So, have we gone out of the Cold War enough to sort of revise that, or, is it a push and pull that, it's people that really want to safeguard that integrity of intelligence process prefer to keep it limited to very, very small number of people with a need-to-know basis. So, of course, I think Laura brought out the case of San Bernardino, and as well on, I think, Ubaldo, you had this whole discussion on, collecting intelligence or, big data, and how, when it really is in national security interest, then, you shouldn't have an expectation of privacy because it allows for, better analysis and, better corpus of data, unless it's, of course, a private conversation or it is an interaction that doesn't have anything to do with intelligence. But as you know, from several cases that you're studying this semester, there is coding, there is encrypting, there is, a lot of different ways that people communicate, and you can argue that even in innocuous, personal relationship conversations, there could be a much more insidious element. And obviously, that that is a question of, if you surrender your expectation of privacy because you don't have anything to hide, you already surrendered a certain process, so you allowing for the interference that you don't have a control of. So again, I thought that that was a really interesting discussion. I'm not sure what you decided on, whether the analyst is not as much necessary to a policymaker as a policymaker is necessary to the ongoing intelligence community. And I think Emily was talking about, raw information doesn't make any sense because a policymaker cannot, would not be able to extract, not knowing the analytical processes. They are not able to extract the relevant intelligence. So the intelligence analyst or intelligence analysis is critical to the decision maker. I think that this could be a back and forth conversation. Certainly, policymakers do need intelligence analysts, but we're going back to that, subordinate relationship in a way, that consumer-oriented relationship. Your discussion then moved to the issue of the sort of threats to the intelligence process that stem from sort of a marketplace of opinions and 24/7 news cycle and social media. And that certainly, is connected to how good is the information that we are basing our decisions on, and in a way, everybody is now their own intelligence analyst, not only a policymaker, but also, people that are en masse consuming different avenues of information. And obviously, because 24/7 news cycle introduced speed to release of information, which very rarely is in any way considered intelligence. A lot of times it's not corroborated, and once it's out there, it influences people's opinions. And Emily, was talking about how she would like to manage the Twitter account or Facebook account for FBI, but certainly the sort of ubiquity of mass of information that's being released, and policymakers are bombarded with those news cycles. At the same time, they have to sort of focus on the proper intelligence analysis, and it's probably it's diffusing that focus for a policymaker. And as you said, the retractions are not as notable as what goes out there and how it hits the general public. So possibly the 24/7 news cycle also created more hunger for the openness and for release of information. And a really interesting case that the 24/7 cycle is sort of, on that verge of, us considering any type of information open source intelligence, which it isn't, but this is sort of with a intelligence reform and a creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and some stress on OSINT, we have a sort of poor understanding of what OSINT truly is. It's a magnificent int, and it's a great supplement to all the other ints. But I think that the social media and the 24/7 news cycle dilute that. And case in point, I have heard about cases to where the leaks are from the intelligence community that get published in the newspapers have been used as a corroborating evidence from both publications in the newspapers. So now the intelligence community is using newspaper sources to corroborate all the other sources that they have based on the leaks. So you're sort of getting to a quite an interesting cycle of recycled information that is not truly in a classical intelligence or research sense corroborated. And I think that's where this whole discussion on OSINT comes in. How valuable isn't? Well, if it's an opinion or if it's a piece of information, it's still not an intelligence. And the corroboration strategies are still very much like all the other ends, and it still needs to follow the intelligence analysis process, but that's a long process. And certainly news media are not able to provide that, So the sources are often minimal and ad hoc. There is a lot of unprecision, and that's and that's huge threat to the way the policy is being made. And I always think back to the fact that I said several years ago, I said tweets do not make policy, and I stand corrected. The times are changing, and a lot of those decisions by policymakers are based on bits and pieces of fragmented opinions. So again, open source information, the news cycle, the social media provide great avenues for foreign counterintelligence and for misinformation, disinformation campaigns. I think Laura was speaking to those points. So as we are looking at the OSINT as a formidable supplement, very ignored for years, and because of the CIA role in intelligence community. Then it does come with the with a drawback of a lot of noise, right? And it's at some point, information, it doesn't matter whether it's retrieved through clandestine sources or through open sources, still needs to go through the same steps of the intelligence analysis process. And certainly news media information does not go through that. Yeah, I don't think you focused on trilogy. I mentioned that you moved to assessment, whether the Director of National Intelligence implementation and restructuring was a success or failure. I don't think you discussed very much the factors, or the changes. What did the reform introduce? And I think it's important to keep in mind that, to me, the major result of the creation of the Office of Director of National Intelligence was to take away a sort of monopoly of secrecy by CIA and the strong influence that CIA had in the intelligence community, to take into account the fact that we had those internal security concerns post 9/11 and ongoing. And we did not have the domestic intelligence apparatus. And so we opted not to create the MI5. And so creating the Office of the Director of National Intelligence was this sort of halfway to remedy the issue, so to speak. So because this office was created, now all the components of the FBI and DHS, and in addition to traditional intelligence community secret holders, the DoD or CIA, you invited more people to the table. So now the director of the CIA is not the only whisperer, so to speak, to the policymaker, but those elements of domestic intelligence, which is different, as all talked about, constitutionally, get sort of leveraged. And, Laura, you had an assessment that, in a way, what DNI does is just another middleman, and, maybe creating more bureaucracy and creating another layer, because after all, the DNI and the director of CIA still, are part of a Security Council and so on and so forth. But certainly, by creating the DNI, we escaped the necessity to create a domestic intelligence agency, so to speak. Now, a really interesting development with the intelligence reform was the fact that FBI did get a much larger portion of the internal security or domestic security intelligence process activities, and this way sort of came from the traditional law enforcement agency to become also the domestic intelligence agency. Now, whether that has been successful or not, you said that you need to have a process work itself out. The Intelligence Reform Act happened in 2004, so barely 14 years, and so we need to look more in a long process to see how it evolves. Certainly, CIA was created in 1940, 47, 48. So the agency has a very strong legacy. The new sort of intelligence entities in the intelligence community that want a bigger piece of a budget and resources for intelligence process are still developing. So I think that I like the way you sort of dismantle that, in a way, perhaps it all depends also on personalities and leadership. That element of leadership, keeps on being very influential in the intelligence process and intelligence community. I don't think leadership and ethics have been a very strong component of training and education in intelligence studies in those organizations. So it's really interesting that you are teasing that out, because certainly, it will depend how strong the D&I is, what expertise, how respected they are by the overall intelligence community, what background they have, and is their background, should it be similar to traditional, director of CIA background, or it shouldn't be? And that's also the ongoing discussion. Again, the issues of leaderships you talked about, we will see whether that model works. You discussing in the upper class, I think the, role of MI5 and, in the UK, and certainly MI5 is not the ideal solution. Apparently, they have had their failures as well, specifically in, post July 7, 2005 events in London. Perhaps coming with a hybrid solution for the United States at a time was a good way to progress and see how the things will develop. I think you also talked about, I'm not sure if you talked about, I think that, I think that's all I have. I think that, the strategic centers for intelligence, that came out of the intelligence reform as well, and you did not discuss that very much. And again, all those different deputies from different intelligence communities that were integrated into that. So I think that you might have a little bit better idea by now by listening to some of the presentations that you had when you took a module on analytical transformation, or evolution, as Laura called it in a discussion board. So with that, I wanted to thank you for your participation, and it was a pleasure. I'm glad that, I don't know, it was your group that mentioned the acronyms, and certainly it is difficult to get through Treverton or Loventhal without revising those and looking at those. So make yourself a list of acronyms, because they are eventually becoming overwhelming. But with that, I wanted to thank you, and I'll see you. I'm looking forward. I already got your third Hangout, so I'm looking forward to watching it and getting back to you. Thanks.